So now let's look at some cases of how this plays out. And we'll start with Central and Eastern Europe at the end of the 1980s. And the revolution, if I made you for this particular semester look at the Qur'an readings, the revolution that Qur'an looks at here is the collective good. He defines this as this mass-supported seizure of political power that aims to transform the social order, the revolution. The common argument in Eastern Europe before 1989 is that people are too complicit in the system and too dependent on authority to revolt. Right? There are a number of factors that made communist Europe an unlikely site for people power, and these included a lack of successful experiences, for example. People learned their lessons from Budapest in 1956, Prague in 1968, when they rose up and they found themselves surrounded by Soviet tanks. Poland's experience of solidarity was also, in general, a failure. Right? You had this massive organization, this massive social movement. More and more people took part, thinking that it was going to succeed, and then you had martial law launched in December of 1981 and throughout the early 1980s. So these should be reason enough to make people think, hey, maybe we shouldn't try this. There's another factor related to the communist system, which is related to any single-party state, which is the cheapness of mobilization. Under the communist system, mass actions were regular and fake. They were just in support of the regime. So they cheapen this sort of collective action. There's also a slashing of what we call horizontal ties under communism. Those ties and relationships among citizens, as opposed to the vertical ties fostered by the state that were between citizens and the state. The goal under communism, and I talked about this in the single-party state, or the totalitarian case, I think. The goal was to destroy horizontal ties, the ties between us citizens, and create a society where people really distrusted each other. And they had very little faith in one another. They only had faith in the all-knowing state. So as a result of all these things, you had a relatively small civil society, a very small civil society. And relatedly, you have what Qur'an calls preference falsification. The difference between public and private preferences. Private preferences are what we really think and what we tell a very few trusted individuals, right? Because we don't trust very many people within society. I can trust my father, my mother, my brother, my sister, and my very close friend, right? And what we tell each other is that the regime sucks. It's responsible for all of our problems. Public preferences are what you allow everyone else to see, thanks to the high costs of showing your true colors. And what we allow everyone else to see is, everything's great, it's fine. Thank goodness we have a trustworthy and wise group of political elites bringing us onward toward some utopia that they've told us they're bringing us towards. Okay? Or at the very minimum, the public preference is going to be, it's politics, I'm not interested, it's fine. So, there are two ways to defeat preference falsification. And what you see here in the background is a picture of North Korean propaganda in a store window. Okay? And this sort of perpetuates this preference falsification. If we see that everybody else accepts this, it's in all the store windows, it's on TV all the time, people seem to like the regime, then we feel like we're outliers, that we're not the norm. That if we stood up against the regime, everyone else would say, what's wrong with you? The regime's great. And we'd be shooting ourselves not just in the foot. So there are a couple ways to defeat preference falsification, to get people to stand up for what they truly believe in. External payoffs and internal payoffs. By external payoffs, we mean those personal rewards, as opposed to the punishments, that you get for showing your true preferences. For example, the hope of getting a better job if this system ends. Maybe under this system, you've been blocked from your career trajectory. Right? You're not allowed to become a professor because you're not a Communist Party member, for example. Or maybe the fear of losing your job or being thrown into jail for criticizing authorities. Right? These are the external costs and payoffs. The internal payoffs refer to integrity, the psychological cost of preference falsification, and subsequently the reward for stopping that. I feel much better if I can openly say what I believe in. And this is the threshold that everyone has that'll determine at what level they'll revolt. Dissidents, those dissidents who would speak out against the regime, were those people who had very low internal a very low, I guess, internal threshold, payoff threshold. Right? They it took very little for them. They could tolerate very little of the lying. Right? They had arguably higher integrity than others. Those complicit and regime activists had much higher levels. They didn't care about so much integrity. Okay? We all have a threshold after which we're willing to engage in collective action. And you can read Gurun's threshold argument on two levels. Our threshold is based on, one, the abuses it takes for someone to say no more, and two, the number of people engaged in collective action that it takes to convince you that it's safe enough to engage yourself. So, in other words, with respect to the abuses, that's the point at which the system, or the benefits of staying in the status quo, the current system, become lower than the costs of staying in the system. As there's more and more abuses, we might finally stand up and say, hey, no one's safe anymore. I'm not going to be safe for staying obedient. Right? This is one risk of terroristic use of police control, for example. So my threshold is determined by two things. First, I might be willing to tolerate state police engaging in corruption every day. Right? But I draw the line somewhere, like where they begin to beat people on the streets. At that point, I'm so mad I'm going to say something. Or, that may be me. You, for example, might not mind if they beat people in the streets on occasion. But it might infuriate you if they start shooting people. Right? We all have our different thresholds. That's the abuses that go beyond an individual's threshold. But the second thing here is the number of people needed. Right? So I might only act on my internal revulsion and my anger only if I find safety in numbers. In other words, other people are speaking up as well. And both of these, again, depend on the particular individual. For example, I might be willing to protest if I see that 10 other people are out there protesting. But if I see that 5 other people are protesting, I'm not going to risk it. It seems like no one else really believes in the cause. It seems like it's too risky. It's easy to crack down on you, on this group of people. Sarah, though, might be willing to protest if she sees 500 people are, but not if she sees 480. And the idea here is that the costs of action fall as more people take to the streets, since A, they can't shoot or arrest all of us, and B, if lots of us are out there, even more will be willing to join in. So what we're talking about is a domino effect, decreasing the likely cost of action even more, right? Because more of the second factor here it's going to be met for more people. So this leaves us with the potential for a revolutionary bandwagon, when all the dominoes fall and people's thresholds fall quickly. They go down quickly, one by one. They're reached, and people join in. And I guess I shouldn't say people's thresholds fall. People's thresholds are met. And these are mutually reinforcing trends, because you've got a fall in thresholds and a rise in public opposition. If lots of people are in the streets rallying against the regime, I may decide that witnessing corruption and not just personal beatings is enough to spur me to action. Right? If there are so many people that it meets my criteria for this, the number of people needed to push me beyond my threshold, then I may be more willing I may be less likely to accept abuses I otherwise would have accepted before, if I see that this number of people has already come into the streets. And this is where you also have heterogeneity, where you have more and more people who are coming in for different reasons. Okay, and this is a positive element here, because we're talking about people moving in to participate. So revolutionary bandwagons frequently need a catalyst, something that lowers someone's threshold, or is enough to reach other people's thresholds to the degree necessary to trigger those who are at higher thresholds. So what are some examples on this? Well, broadly, we can talk about failure to deliver on promises, when a regime doesn't deliver on all the promises that it promises, that it makes. More narrowly, things like not being paid for 5 months in a row, a lack of medication, the arrest of some respected social figure, the shooting of civilians, perhaps promises of international support for revolution, which lower our thresholds. They lower our thresholds here because if we expect international support, maybe we don't need 500 people in the streets to feel safe and feel confident. Maybe we only need 20 people in the streets. And if we know the international community is backing us, then that counts itself for, a bunch of people. Maybe if the regime promises it's not going to use force, maybe that's enough to lower our threshold, to make us feel safer. So, all these things affect the threshold. Now, what do you get when this doesn't occur? You have people living in what we call pluralistic ignorance, where no one knows each other's thresholds because of this preference falsification. If no one knows each other's threshold, no one knows, everyone assumes that they're the only ones who are fed up enough with the regime to want to see it end. Standing up to the state under those conditions would be a very dangerous thing. And the result is what we have frequently, which is a latent bandwagon. Everyone's sitting and tolerating the system when just one person's reaction to something could mean the difference between loyalty and fighting the system for everybody. Okay, this revolutionary bandwagon versus latent bandwagon. And this is why you can sometimes find these very sudden movements. Look at Egypt in 2011. Look at Ukraine in 2014. As these things go, they fall like dominoes. More and more people come out as their thresholds are met.